Greetings. I'm Matt Henderson, pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Clarksville, Georgia, and this is a special midweek message in our series on Galatians. We've spent the last 2 weeks in the first chapter of Paul's letter to the churches in Galatia, his introduction and background to why he's writing. For he's concerned for the churches as they have allowed some deceptive teachers to influence their beliefs and to lead them away from the true gospel Paul first taught them. These unidentified teachers have convinced the new believers in Galatia that they must follow the rites and rituals of the Jewish law, including circumcision. This is not an insignificant difference of opinion, but what Paul identifies as a completely different and false gospel. This is not a gospel built upon the grace of Christ. In the first chapter, Paul presents his own background and defends his authority as an apostle of Jesus Christ. He has received the message of grace that he brought to them directly from the risen Christ in a powerful revelation that completely reoriented his life. As he was previously in complete opposition to the work of the church, Paul shares how God used Paul's unworthiness as a show of the power of grace. This understanding of grace is what makes Paul's message so insistent. The remaining content of Paul's introduction includes a description of some of the interactions between himself and other disciples, including Peter, the apostle to the Jerusalem church. Paul continues his description of these interactions and the tensions there now in what we've labeled the second chapter. Remember that these chapter and verse designations are a much later addition to the letter, which was originally intended to be read in one hearing. But let's now read the first 14 verses of chapter 2, a continuation of Paul's description of his own calling, his authority, which comes from Christ and no other subordinate, and his understanding of his responsibility to the gospel and to proclaiming grace to the Gentiles. Chapter 2 of Galatians, beginning with verse 1. Then, after 14 years, I went again to Jerusalem, he says, with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up in response to a revelation, then laid before me There I laid before them, though only in a private meeting with the acknowledged leaders, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised, though he was a Greek, but because of false believers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus so that they might enslave us, we did not submit to them even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might always remain with you. And from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, he who worked through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They asked only one thing, that we remember the poor, which was actually what I was eager to do. Now, verse 11. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate, for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by the hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We'll be continuing in chapter 2 on Sunday, but the tone there will be less antagonistic. Here in today's reading, you might have sensed some tension between Paul and Peter. When we don't have the luxury of the complete context, of the content of any actual interactions, and whether through writing or in person. But we also don't have Peter's side of the circumstances described either from his own first-person account or by one of the other familiar historians of the early church period, like Luke, the author of Acts. And our first impression may be one of discomfort in Paul's description of the conflict he experienced in Antioch. We might wonder, aren't Christians supposed to get along? But as uncomfortable as it might seem, I believe it's a healthy interaction and proof of an important truth. Conflict is not a sign of unhealthy relationships, then or now, but how conflict is dealt with makes the interaction healthy or unhealthy. And in addition, that conflict exists shouldn't be a cause for alarm, especially as we see it comes to healthy resolution. And in the end, Paul demonstrates here that in the midst of disagreement and differing understandings, there is often room for mutual recognition and respect, and that the most important value to the church, both then and today, is unity. Paul and Peter, one the apostle to the Gentiles and the other the apostle to the Jews, work through their differences to show not that they serve two, but rather they serve one united church, which rests completely on the grace of Jesus Christ. They recognize the grace within each other. It can be said that Paul's anxiety and his emotion is rooted not from an uncertainty about the truth of the gospel, but from a fear for the unity of the church. On what can we hold different perspectives and yet still respect and value each other? On what can we disagree and still recognize the power of God's grace at work within the other? Paul and Peter demonstrate that the gospel produces a church in which unity exists with amazing diversity. And yet unity is not to be confused with mere tolerance or indifference or absence of strife. Like love, which we are called to be about first and foremost, it longs for expression in some tangible way, the participation of one partner in the life of the other. Here, In brief, Paul describes a longing for the freedom to which he believes the gospel of God's radical grace leads. Grace, it cannot be compelled or forced, not on God's behalf, nor on our own. The matter of his companions, or any believer for that matter, being required to follow Jewish practices like dietary restrictions or circumcision, is not an expression of faith or grace, Paul says. However, he implies if it is not understood as a requirement, but as an expression of our personal freedom and our own understanding of a faithful response, as it is to Peter and perhaps Timothy and others, then let that be their personal practice, as long as one doesn't feel compelled or required to do so as entry into a relationship with God. Paul indicates that Jewish tradition is not the real concern here, but rather the obligation upon someone, especially outside of the Jewish tradition, to follow. If Peter, Timothy, whose grandmother is Jewish, or anyone else for that matter, sees that Jewish expression as one of faith rather than a requirement, then he will not stand in the way, Paul says. But he does caution that in so following these traditional expressions, you cannot do so hypocritically and treat others who in their freedom choose not to as second rate. We will continue to see through the remainder of the letter how the matter of the primacy and finality of God's grace should inform all of one's faith. Yet here we see also how important it is to recognize that grace within those we disagree with. For too often we fail to acknowledge that God's grace shown to us is not something upon which we can hold over someone else. Some of the most hypocritical positions and notions come from Christians who think they've got an exclusive corner of what God is up to and fail to see God at work in others. We'll turn to the end of chapter 2 on Sunday, and I hope you'll join us, either in person or online, live or later. But until then, may the peace of Christ be with you.